From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. Last year, as the world battled the pandemic, there was another terrifying battle below the surface. And now survivors are seeking refuge and a safe place to call home. It was bad last year. Distress signals were coming from countries around the world wherever the virus loomed, and lockdown measures followed. So did the spiking numbers in violent abuse. Gender-based violence increased by more than 20% here in Canada. In some places, an eerie silence, as scores of women were believed to be trapped in lockdown with their abusers. In others, overflowing shelters for those trying to escape the abuse. Last year, at the peak of this crisis, this is what Andrea Gunraj of the Canadian Women's Foundation told us about what was going on.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't want to underplay the importance of the virus, and I don't want to underplay the risks and the fears that people are facing right now, for sure. But I think it is just too obvious that gender-based violence, domestic violence, elder abuse, child abuse is just far too common, period. It was this way always before the pandemic, and that we see a spike right now is something to be really concerned about and to want to do something about. But I think it's really important that we don't look to the pandemic or look to the virus and say that is the cause. We have a deeper cause here that we have to address, and I just don't want us to get distracted from those deeper issues, nor think that the kinds of solutions are going to be like just as long as the social isolation happens or the investments is only kind of a one-time thing. I think it's longer-term solutions and deeper investment than we've ever really dedicated in Canada.
Ontario law gives people facing domestic violence, abuse, and trafficking priority access to social housing. Those applications spiked by more than 50% last year, a reflection of the violence that erupted during a pandemic. The Star's affordable housing reporter, Victoria Gibson, joins me to talk more about these soaring numbers, how important stable housing is for survivors in uncertain situations, and how tricky it might be to actually find it. Hi, Victoria. Thanks for being on the podcast with me.
Always happy to chat.
So can you talk to me a little bit about what's been the state of subsidized housing in Toronto and what's been the impact of the pandemic since last year?
Absolutely. So Toronto's social housing wait list is well known for being extremely long. As of the end of March, there were more than 79,000 households on the list. And new house entrants are warned that they can face waits that stretch on for more than a decade, depending on the kind of housing that they're hoping for. And that's where priority lists come in. So some populations like the terminally ill and the homeless are put on a faster track, recognizing more urgent need for units. And by provincial law, one of those priority categories is specifically designed to house people who have been through domestic violence, abuse, and trafficking, as well as people who have sort of been still living in those situations. And I'd heard anecdotal reports throughout the pandemic from social service workers who were saying they were seeing more and more cases of domestic violence pop up during COVID-19. And I wanted to dig a little bit more into the data of that particular wait list. And what I found was that the number of new entrants to that priority category was 55% higher in 2020 than it had been in 2019. So where 638 households had qualified for the priority list to escape violence or trafficking in the year pre-pandemic, last year that surged to 992.
So the numbers have basically spiked by more than 55%, as you're saying. And these numbers began soaring right after we saw a spike on the numbers of what a lot of people started to call the shadow pandemic of domestic violence during COVID, right?
The jump that I saw did line up with COVID, yeah. Looking at the waitlist data by quarter, the first 3 months of the year were pretty similar to what we saw in 2019. There were 180 applications on that list from January to March that qualified as survivors of violence or trafficking versus 182 in those same months in 2019. So very comparable. But then it nearly doubled between April and June. There were 355 households that were added to the priority list in that time, which is a lot higher than the 194 in the same months of 2019. So it showed us that, after March, when we declared the pandemic emergency in Toronto, those numbers really skyrocketed up.
Is there a reason why there was a surge in housing applications, not during the start of the pandemic when everything was in lockdown, but around the time when things began reopening?
That's something that I heard from Nina Gorka, who's the director of shelters and clinical services for the YWCA in Toronto. It's not something the data outright told us because we don't actually know when between April and June those 355 applications came in. They aren't broken down by month. Nina, whose organization runs two of Toronto's violence against women shelters, said she saw demand for domestic violence supports in general quiet down a little bit at the start of the pandemic. And then once things started opening a little bit at the beginning of last summer, they really started to drive upwards. And her view was that victims who may have been unable to reach out for help, including completing things like social housing applications, while at home with watchful abusers, may have suddenly had a sort of window to act, to reach out and to say, I got to get out of here.
A lot of advocates were talking about that early on in the pandemic, about victims potentially being trapped in their homes with their abusers during lockdown. So that's anecdotally a factor, right? Let's talk about the government's priority list for housing. Who is eligible to get on this list and how does someone get on it? Is there a process?
So people are eligible for this list if they're still living through domestic violence or abuse or trafficking, as well as if they've fled those living conditions within the past 3 months. And that's according to the city's most recently shared application data. They have the forms on their website that lay out all of the criteria. And, that includes there are cases where somebody can qualify without living with their abuser. One example being a sponsored immigrant who's being abused by somebody who is supporting them. And a person can also be eligible if they're in a forced marriage that involves exploitation or if they're living in conditions of servitude. So the application asks for a lot of details. You have to name the abuser, the applicant's relationship to them, when they first started living together. It asks things like whether the person intends to permanently separate from their abuser, whether they're in a shelter, whether a trafficking survivor is in a recovery program to help them sort of return to a safe and normal life. And it also requires that a professional verifies that the abuse is happening. That can be somebody like a doctor, a teacher, guidance counselor, a police officer. And if that's not possible, somebody familiar with the abuse who doesn't qualify as a professional can testify to the situation if they submit a declaration like a notarized affidavit laying out the facts of the situation. And since this is social housing we're talking about, where part of your rent costs are covered, you also have to qualify under rent geared to income rules, which mean you have to show financial need when you're applying for this form of housing.
We'll be right back. It does seem like a fairly detailed process. How difficult is it to apply and to go through the system? You have to keep in mind there might be potential trauma or triggers involved for victims of situations like these, and people might be too afraid or psychologically impacted to talk about what they went through or fill out a lot of lengthy applications with details, right? Did the advocates speak about that a little bit?
One thing I did hear while working on this story was how the pandemic made it so much harder for people to reach out for help in any form. And that can include filling out applications and doing this kind of intensive paperwork. Farhan, who's a gender-based violence expert here in Toronto, told me that while people were stuck at home, she knew about victims saying they needed to use the bathroom or walk the dog just to get a couple minutes to talk to her team and talk about what they were living through. They've been trying to find workarounds. They've been trying to see if, somebody who's going through those situations can talk them through verbally what they need to fill out on the application forms. And then the team can help do the actual physical application, just to work around the fact that people were at home all the time. There wasn't that reprieve of, someone goes out to work for however many hours a day. It made the whole process a lot more complicated, is what she told me her and her team have been seeing. And that's before we even get into the kind of concerns you were raising around the fear that can come from creating an exit strategy. And I don't think that's something we can necessarily quantify.
Is the lack of affordable housing potentially the greatest barrier to getting out of a violent or abusive situation where victims who can be disproportionately women with children don't know where they will go if they do manage to escape the situation, the uncertainty of it?
Yeah, I don't think we can necessarily say what the greatest barrier is, or if there is one greatest barrier, because it really depends on the circumstance. But housing is definitely a major part of this conversation. I spoke to Shazeen Suleiman for this story. She's a midwife in Toronto, and she works with victims of violence through a perinatal clinic. And she put it pretty bluntly that sometimes it isn't about working up the guts to leave. It's a practical question of where are you going to go otherwise? And that question can be tough enough alone. It gets even more complicated if you're, say, a mother who's trying to leave with your children. And Farah, the gender-based violence expert, told me that when affordable housing alternatives aren't there, she's seen victims just decide to stay put. They're choosing sort of the devil they know over the devil they don't. Because if you don't have housing lined up, there are options like couch surfing or crashing with a friend, but that's a lot harder during the pandemic when we've all been sort of cloistering our households away from each other. So another option becomes the shelter system, which can be a daunting prospect for many people. And you and I spoke last year about the number of children who are living in Toronto's homeless shelters and how long families can get stuck in that system. Several of the families I spoke to for that story had been in the shelter system for close to a year, more than a year. And that sort of leaves them in flux. They may have fled the abusive situation they were in before, but they're somewhere that they can't necessarily stabilize. It's a temporary space. It comes with its own stresses. There were entire families living in single rooms. And Nina from the YWCA pointed out that there just weren't enough shelter beds for the amount of calls for help that come in Toronto. So this conversation about housing for survivors of violence circles back to the conversation about the shelter system, which will ultimately bear the weight of the problem when permanent solutions aren't available or readily accessible.
And you do mention in your reporting how the waiting lists are tremendously long as well for subsidized housing, right? In general.
They are, yeah. We started the year with around 81,000 households on the list. That's gone down to around 79,000 as of the end of March, which is the last time we have public reports.
Victoria, how have the stresses of COVID-19, which have disproportionately impacted women, as we've seen, played a role in these rising numbers that we're talking about now?
That's a great question, and it's one that was raised while I was reporting this story. Farah and I were talking about job losses. We were talking about financial stress during the pandemic, which she and others pointed to as a risk factor for violence in the home. And she pointed out that it wasn't just about household stress and the conditions while they're there. If someone lost their income in this past year or saw it greatly reduced, it may have made it harder for them to make a plan to leave. If you don't have a job, the prospect of fleeing your home can be a lot scarier. And that's when she pointed to what we know from public data, which is that women have been disproportionately affected by pandemic-related job losses. And she worries that may have meant more women hunkering down in abusive scenarios without the financial ability to create an exit plan.
And you've already talked about the shelter system. We spoke about it earlier as well, and the burden on the capacity there. What do advocates say will be the long-term consequences of this increased domestic abuse and waiting lists of survivors looking for home and stability? Do we need some kind of multi-level national strategy to deal with this, a long-term solution?
When I was talking to Nina, she was talking about just that, the long-term consequences and how much we still don't know. She suspects that there's going to be need that goes well beyond housing. People who have been through domestic violence through the pandemic are going to need help to process what's happened and reset their lives after this. And that could include need for more social supports, more mental health care. It could mean looking at what kind of childcare is available to women in particular who are leaving those sorts of situations and trying to reset their lives. So in terms of whether a new national strategy would be the answer, that's hard to say concretely, but the people I spoke to for this story who work with survivors of violence directly do believe that more is needed, and particularly more affordable housing to get people started on that path to stability as soon as possible.
And like you said, supports on multiple levels, probably. Thank you so much, Victoria. That was very insightful.
Anytime.
I was talking to the Star's affordable housing reporter, Victoria Gibson. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So-Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.